Hello, everyone. As I blind myself, welcome and welcome this evening to our webinar. I am Ned Bowman. I am the outreach coordinator for the Great Basin Bird Observatory. We're a nonprofit research group based here in Reno. We've been conducting bird research throughout Nevada and the surrounding area since the early 2000s. And this event is part of our winter lecture series. We've got another one coming up at the end of March. We'll be talking about shorebirds. We've got some in April as well. There's a previous one recorded on our YouTube channel, and we do these every year in the wintertime for giving folks something to do when the birding is quiet out there. So thanks everyone for tuning in this evening. And tonight I'm excited to have Katie Smith talking to us. She is a PhD student at the University of Nevada, Reno. She's going to be talking to us about molt and why that matters to birds and to us. So without further ado, I'm going to sit down and turn it over to Katie.
Okay, thank you, Ned. Hello, all. Woo. Thank you for coming. Today I get to go on mini rants about what I love about feathers and birds and molt.
Oh, is that turned on? Or do you have the USB plugged into your?
I don't know.
There might be a little USB chip to plug into your laptop.
Oh, haha. Oh, I only have one USB.
Oh, and we need it for the camera. All right, you might just have to.
Okay, sorry, but I'm gonna
gonna.
run in front of the screen. You want me? I can sit on the ground and move it. This is fine. Okay, to briefly introduce myself. Like I said, my name is Katie and I've been in California my whole life. This is my first time living in Nevada. So I grew up in Ventura in Southern California. I went to school at UC Davis and that brought me up here to the Great Basin. I started studying sage grouse about 7 years ago and I did that for 5-ish years. And then in my journey after I graduated, I studied white-crowned sparrows and spotted sandpipers out in the Molt Basin. And then in the last few years, I've been doing some phalarope work with both Wilson's phalaropes and redneck phalaropes. Also did some songbird banding out in Point Reyes area. And this is what got me really excited about molt. So now I'm here at University of Nevada, Reno, hoping to do some work on molt. Okay, so, mine is it's a very clicky presentation, so it might get annoying, but, okay, what is a bird? To start from the basics, birds evolved from dinosaurs. And so about 160 million years ago, feathers first evolved. And these feathers that first evolved were like bristle-like, kind of like hollow, cylindrical structures. And they were speculated to have evolved for insulation to keep dinosaurs, to keep dinosaurs warm. And then a couple million years later, we have tufted feathers, which is more closely to what we have today. And then this lineage eventually gave rise to true birds, what we have today. So we know all this from fossil structures, and it's speculated that the early dinosaurs looked something like this. So this is kind of the bristly, hollow feathers that first came about, and then as feathers diversified in their structure and their function, they moved to different parts of the body, they gained color, they gained pattern, and we'll talk about all this in a little bit. Okay. So a quote that I really love, and I'm super biased, but I think it's a really cool quote, is that feathers are one of evolution's cleverest functions. And this is because feathers are so diverse, they're so versatile, they serve so many functions, and we'll talk about all this and how exciting they are. Okay, what is a feather? So feathers are a lot like our hair or fingernails. They're made of keratin. They're dead structures, so once they've grown, they can't be modified at all. In order to do that, birds molt, regrow new feathers. And they're anchored into the body, into the skin feather follicles. And that is where they get their blood supply from, just at the feather follicle, but otherwise the rest of the feather doesn't get any blood or have any feeling. There are several kinds of feathers. This is not an exhaustive list, but we have flight feathers, which include the wing feathers and tail feathers. So wing feathers, if you find one on the ground, are asymmetrical on either side of the main vein. Tail feathers are symmetrical. Flight feathers on the wing are really used for like lift and power. Tail feathers are used for maneuvering and steering, like you see falcons do in the air. Down feathers are used for warmth. That's kind of deep down inside the birds. This is the kind of feathers that you find in your grandma's strangely comfortable feather bed, or like in your couch cushions. And then your contour feathers is what birds use for protection. This covers most of the bird. This is used for waterproof, weatherproof, and to keep the bird aerodynamic and smooth. Okay, birds have a lot of feathers, between 1 and 25,000, which is a huge range of feathers. But this depends on two main things. One, how big the bird is, so bigger birds have more feathers. And also the kind of habitat that the bird lives in. So if they live in a cold habitat, they need more feathers to keep warm. If they live in a wet habitat, they need more feathers to keep them waterproof. It can take up 5 to 10% of the total mass of birds, which I think is a tremendous amount given feathers are light as a feather folding. Okay, so, well, this is gonna be a very clicky part, but, so as an example, ruby crowned kinglets have about 1,200 feathers. Does anybody want to guess the species or the group of birds that has the fewest feathers? They're really small. Yeah. Hummingbirds? Yes, hummingbirds. Hummingbirds have the fewest feathers, around 1,000, so they're at the small end of the spectrum. This study specifically counted ruby-throated hummingbird feathers, about 940. Does anybody want to guess the species with the most amount of feathers? Unless you know this fun fact, this is a virtually impossible question to guess. So it's kind of a lame question. But this one, penguin, that's what I guessed too. That's a really good guess. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's swans. Swans have around 25,000 feathers, which is a huge amount. Most of the feathers are found on the neck, and that's because when they forage, they dip their neck underwater and they get all that gunky, monkey stuff down there. And so their feathers are really well protected to keep them nice and dry and warm. Okay, and then we have, for reference, a robin at about 3,000 feathers. And then some birds, like chickadees, a lot of birds do this, have I guess it's not showing on the screen, but have a variable amount of feathers depending on the time of year. So they counted birds at 2 different times, before and after a molt at different times of the year. And they found in the winter that this study was specifically done on black-capped chickadees, but it goes for a lot of birds, especially ones that overwinter in cold areas, that in the winter they have closer to 2,000 with 1,700 feathers. And then in the summer, spring, warmer time, they have about 1,300 feathers. Okay. So, feathers, as many of us are probably bird watchers, feathers are the things that we can love and appreciate most about birds. They have tremendous diversity in their color and their pattern. And it's speculated that even the dinosaurs used feather coloration for lots of different things, from camouflage all the way to sexual communication. Okay, this is my favorite part. So feathers get their color in 2 main ways, from pigments and from structure. So there are 2 different kinds of pigments. Pigments are actual molecules that are deposited into a growing feather. The first kind of pigment is a carotenoid, and carotenoids are obtained from diet. These are the reds, oranges, yellows, pinks. A lot of people know the fact that hummingbirds get their color, flamingos get their color from their diet, that pink color. So pinker flamingos have better diet. That goes for all these orange, reds, yellows, pinks. So a brighter tanager is going to have a lot more carotenoids and have a better diet than a dull tanager. And because of this, carotenoids are an honest signal. It accurately reflects the quality of the individual. And so a really bright tanager can honestly display to the females, for example, look at me, I'm a sexy male, I'm in really good condition, I'm really good at foraging, come meet with me. And then melanins are the second kind of pigmentation. Melanins can be directly synthesized from the body, unlike carotenoids. Carotenoids you have to get from your environment. Melanins you do not. You can make them themselves. They're cheap and easy to make. So because of this, melanins are a dishonest signal. And so they did a study and they found that this black melanin patch on the chest of house sparrows is a status symbol. It correlates with their rank in the social hierarchy. And so the highest ranked male will have the biggest and boldest melanin patch. And they artificially enhance the size of the patch on some birds, and they found that those males that were poorer quality but had a greater patch that was artificially enhanced got totally attacked by the other males in this group. And that's because it's an honest signal. And so it has to be kept in check by the social system because it can't be kept in check just by a biological system. So that's the melanins. And those are the two main pigments. Then we have our structural colors. And structural colors, unlike pigments that are molecules deposited into growing feathers, structural colors are the actual structure of the feather interacts with light waves and reflects certain colors. So this is like the color blue, white, and even iridescent colors. Get this from structure. Iridescence is when the light reflects in a different way. This is what you get on the gorge of hummingbirds, or like that shiny, beautiful back of starlings or blue blackbirds. And then the most fascinating is the color green. And I, for a long time, wondered what the color green was. It wasn't in any of my lectures or bird talks growing up. And that's because green is harder to evolve. It's harder to get. Green is yellow carotenoids overlaying blue structure color. So it requires the independent bringing in of two separate colors laying on top of each other. So that's why you don't see green too often in nature, which is really neat. Additionally, you may not know, but a lot of birds, not all, but a lot of birds can see in the ultraviolet spectrum. So this is a study they did on saw-whet owls, and they pulled out their wing and they shone an ultraviolet light on it, and the feathers illuminate differently. So this is just one of many examples of how we perceive birds as different than how other birds perceive birds. And so in this picture, you can find, I'll move over here in this picture, you can see that the different generations of feathers, which we'll get into in a little bit, show the different colors. So this first picture is a hatchier bird. It was a bird that was hatched recently. It's just a baby, and all of its feathers were grown in recently. They're all the same generation, so they're all the same color. And then here you have two different generations of feathers. You can see that in the lighter ones and in the brighter ones. These ones are newer. And then here's a third-year bird that has 3 generations of feathers. These ones are the oldest, and then the like moderate, and then the newest ones out there. Okay, what is the purpose of feathers? So they have a lot of different color, they have a lot of different structure, and this gives birds a lot of things to do with their feathers. So this is another flipping part. Okay, so feathers, as we know, first are speculated to evolve for insulation. Feathers are really good at keeping birds warm. And this is because feathers are hollow structures. They trap air inside, and air is known as a poor conductor of heat, which means it doesn't release heat into the environment very easily. It retains heat really well. So because of that, hollow feathers are filled with air, and that keeps the bird warm as the air in the feathers retains the heat. When you see a really cold bird, like this cute little junco, they'll fluff up their feathers, get a lot of air bubbles in their feathers, and that'll retain heat even better. So hollow feathers are good for thermoregulating, but they're also really good for flight. So birds do a lot to keep themselves light so they can fly really well. The first one, of course, is hollow feathers. They also have hollow bones. They don't have teeth. Teeth are really heavy. They all have these bills and beaks that are fairly light. They're also the only vertebrate group in which all species have external eggs. Even species like snakes and lizards that we know as laying eggs, there are some species in those groups that give live birth. Birds do not. They're the only vertebrate in which none of them give live birth. And so this is all because eggs, embryos, carrying them, developing them, they're very heavy, and you can't fly with that. So to not compromise flight, they get rid of their eggs as fast as possible. Okay, communication. This is a lot to do with color and shape and those extravagant feathers that you see all over. And this is largely for communication purposes. This is to communicate with rival males and to communicate territoriality, to say, look how good of a condition I am. I grow all these fancy, expensive feathers. Don't mess with me. Same thing, you want to communicate that same message to a potential mate. I'm in really good quality. I grow these males, come mate with me. So feathers are often used in communication. Camouflage, of course. We see this often here in the Great Basin, this exposed area where there's a lot of hawks, like our sage hens, our ptarmigans. Buoyancy and hydrophobia is a really big one. So we want to keep feathers dry, and the air that traps inside them also helps keep water birds like ducks afloat. And wet feathers are bad for two big reasons. Wet feathers don't thermoregulate very well, and wet feathers don't fly very well. So that's why most birds have hydrophobic feathers. Of the birds that do get their feathers wet, like cormorants, because they want to be like fast swimmers, be able to dive deep, get a lot of prey, you'll see them often with their wings out drying. That's because they don't want to compromise the flight feather function. So they're getting their feathers dry after they've used them for their swimming purposes. Finally, we have some fun modified feathers that are used for some cool things. So we have a lot of flycatchers here in the Great Basin that have modified feather bristles around their bill. And this is speculated to be some sort of sensory organ that helps them find insects in the air nearby and even work as like a trap to like bring them into the bill. So some of the many functions of feathers, and because they're so important, it's really important to maintain them. Does anybody want to guess what percent of the day, up to what percent of the day birds spend preening and taking care of their feathers? Any guesses? 40, 60. Man, those are bigger than I thought. It's about 25%. Those are all really good guesses. 25%, which is a tremendous amount of the day they spend preening and taking care of their feathers, provided all the things that they have to do. To facilitate this, birds, most of them have what's called a preen gland. It's located on their rump, just above their tail. It's a modified sebaceous or oil gland, and it secretes oil. When I gave this presentation to my sister in practice, she called it a modified, or what she called it a built-in Vaseline dispenser. But the oil that is secreted from preen glands is incredibly useful. So it helps protect the feathers from lots of things, from UV damage to feather lice to parasites and more. And also is an oil, of course, so it keeps the feathers dry. And then finally, a lot of the oil in preen glands contains these smelly chemicals called pheromones. And pheromones, people for a while thought that birds didn't have a sense of smell. They do have a good sense of smell, and often birds will use pheromones for extra communication. So this is really the case with a lot of seabirds. They'll use it to find their nest. They'll use it for individual or mate recognition. And even the study found that dark-eyed juncos use pheromones to tell sexes apart. Okay, despite how well you may take care of your feathers, they will wear and fade over time, sadly. But this is a fascinating thing because we can track this. And once they get to a certain age, feathers deteriorate really quickly. The two main threats to feathers are UV damage and wear and tear. So this picture on the left shows the UV damage. And so you can imagine when the wing is closed, you can kind of see based on this picture how the feathers are kind of overlaid on top of each other. And so when the wing closes, these parts, these tips of each feather are still exposed to the sun. So whether the wing is open or closed, these tips are always exposed to the sunlight. And because of that, they have this visible sun wear that they experience over time. And sun wear degrades them, and it makes them extra susceptible to breakage. Okay, in addition to sun damage, you just have wear and tear from reckless flying behavior. So no matter how careful a bird is, they can be reckless at times and whack a wing against a branch, or a toe scratching in the dirt and it drags its feathers along, or what have you. And so feathers break down no matter what all the time. What's really interesting is, as I've said, we have pigments that are molecules deposited to feathers as they're growing, and certain pigments give the feather strength. And so melanin is the strongest pigment. And so when you have melanin deposited into a feather, it makes it really strong. And so this picture on the right, you can see a newly molted, beautiful gull wing, how nice. And then you have your crappy old gull wing. And the parts that are white and not pigmented, those are first to go. The part that's nice and black and has a lot of that melanin pigmented in it, that is pretty durable, but it will still wear over time. Okay, some birds use this to their advantage. So we know the European starling, there's a lot of them in this area. I think there's a lot of them everywhere. And they have two different plumages at two different times of the year. And that's not because of the difference in feather, but that's a difference in the feather wear. And so when they first molt, they have these beautiful white tips on their feathers. And then as the year goes on, as they go about their reckless lives, then they break down. Birds aren't actually totally reckless. As they go about their lives, the feathers break down, and the white tips, because they're not pigmented, they break down a lot, and then you're kind of left with these block feathers. So this is the case for a couple birds. Snow buntings do this as well. But again, despite this, the black feathers will wear and fade with time. So that brings us to molt, the most exciting topic in the world, in my biased opinion. And molt is this fascinating process. It's the growth or the dropping and regrowth of feathers. It happens about once a year. Every bird does it about once a year. And an excellent quote by National Audubon is that not all birds migrate, not all birds breed, but no matter what, every year, every bird molts. It's a life or death situation. And I really like this quote because it compares molt to the other life history stages of birds. Birds have three main fundamental life history stages, and those are identified as migration, breeding, and molt. Now, as Audubon so eloquently wrote, migration, not all birds are migratory. Of the ones that are migratory, not all of them migrate every year. Some birds, a lot of shorebirds do this. They'll stay the wintering ground in their first year of life because they're not going to be good enough quality to breed. They don't want to breed. They'll just stay there and not waste the energy of migrating. Same with breeding. If an individual is not in good enough condition to breed, it won't breed that year. Molt is not the case. Every year, every bird molts, no matter what. Okay, and we know close to nothing about molt. And this is what's really, really interesting. We have three main life history stages of birds. Two are super well studied. 99% of the literature on birds is about migration and breeding. Close to nothing is on molt. We know very, very, very little. And it's the main life history stage, it's the one they never skip. Migratory and reproductive biologists do not like when I say this, but I would like to argue that molt is the most fundamental life history stage. I'd like to say important, but I'm not that brave. But it's the most fundamental, I would say. And as the most fundamental, in parentheses, important life history stage, it is totally understudied. And this is really important for two main reasons. The first one is it's really exciting in the realm of scientific discovery, right? We know close to nothing about this, and it's one of the main things. It's this big untold story in the world of animal biology. And the second one is that it's important to have a basic fundamental understanding of biology if we are to make informed conservation decisions, right? We have so much information on migration, we have so much information on breeding, and from those studies, we've made conservation and management laws and rules and regulations, like the Migratory Bird Act. Because we don't know anything on molt, we don't know how they're being affected, how they're vulnerable during this stage. So it's really important. 1/3 of the picture is missing. Okay, we know a few things though. There are some things we do know. So what is it that we know? Okay, the first thing we know about molt is that it's this highly, highly patterned process. So this isn't the case for every bird, and most of my knowledge is restricted to birds of North America. Tropical birds are a whole different species, or well, yes, different species, but also a whole different volume. But we know that molt happens in this highly patterned way. So feathers grow in these distinct groups. They're kind of types of feathers. So we have our primaries, which I'm sure many of us have heard of. Primaries on the outside of the wing, secondaries on the inside of the wing, etc. And it happens in these groups in specific ways. So we'll start with the central primary and the central secondary. So this is secondary 1, this is primary 1, and they work their way out and they work their way in. So we'll start with primary 1, primary 2, 3, 4, etc. Secondary 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So it happens in this highly, highly patterned way. This is a pretty conserved process across most species. So this is a really great picture that kind of shows this. So you see in the middle, there's this contrast between old feathers and new feathers. These like dark, they're faded, right? They're worn, right? And ooh, so beautiful, nice mirror, right? New feathers here. So we know that this is primary 1, this brand new one, and this is secondary 1. The secondaries haven't started their molt yet. So we have primary 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 3, 4, 5 are still growing. Then primary 6 is missing. It's a molt-related gap. So just shed, and it hasn't yet grown back in. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are there. They're bright, they're shiny, they're new, they're growing. And then 6 is missing. 7, 8, 9. Most birds have 9 or 10 primaries. 7, 8, 9. Yuck, old, gross. They need to be replaced. And then the secondaries will shortly follow. Okay, so we know molt is highly patterned. We also know that there are specific molt strategies that certain birds follow. When I say strategy, I mean how many feathers they molt, which feathers they molt, and how many times a year they molt. So some birds have a special molt in their first year of life where they molt a little bit as a juvenile, they molt a little bit later as a juvenile, and they'll molt once a year as an adult. Some birds molt twice as an adult. A lot of like shorebirds do this, and it's known as their breeding plumage that they molt into at the second time of the year. And so this is what is defined as molt strategy. Which feathers they're molting and how often do they molt. Okay, let's focus on our complex basic strategy. It says complex basic strategy is what it's called. It's one of the more simple ones, but molt is complex by nature, so it's still a little complicated. But this is what a lot of our local songbirds do. Okay. This is a little confusing, but we'll go through it. So, in your first hatch, you're in your juvenile plumage. These are the feathers that you grow when you're a baby in the nest. Now, when you're growing feathers and you're a baby in the nest, you're not very good at growing feathers. But that's for pretty good reasons. The first one is that you're not getting food yourself, you're getting fed by your parents, and you have to compete with your greedy little siblings around you. So you're getting not as much food as you could if you're just out by yourself. You're also in a little bowl of food for a predator. So you want to molt, grow your feathers, and get the heck out of there as quickly as possible. So juvenile feathers are growing really quickly, and because of that, they're growing really poorly. So first set of feathers you're in your juvenile feathers. Then, because your feathers are so crappy the first time around, and you have to migrate and go a whole year, you need to replace some of your feathers. So just a couple weeks, couple months after your juvenile feathers, when you get out of the nest, you need to replace a couple of those feathers. And so, again, it's not all of them, that's too expensive, you don't have time for that. So you just molt a couple of the important ones. So these new feathers that you molt in the fall of your first year are called formative feathers. So now you're in your formative plumage. And formative plumage, right, you have some retained juvenile feathers and some replaced formative feathers. Okay, then we go migrate, and then we go spend winter on the beach in Mexico, and then we come back. And now we're in our second year of life. And now you're a big bird, and you breed all by yourself, and you have a nest, and that's exciting. And then, oh boy, it's been a whole year, and I have old crappy feathers, a lot of which are still juvenile feathers, so I need to molt. So in the fall of your second life, around the same time that you have your formative feathers, in the fall of your second year, you molt, and this time it's a complete molt, a wardrobe reset, you completely redo it. And now you're in your adult feathers. This is called the basic plumage. And so you have your juvenile feathers, you have your formative feathers, both in your first year of life. In the second year of life, you do a factory reset, do all your feathers, you migrate back. And now you repeat this cycle every year for your whole life. So this is a strategy that a lot of our local songbirds do. They have a special first year, and then every year after that, they just do one full, complete molt in the fall before they migrate. Okay, so again, that's one of the 4 main strategies that we have here. We get into other ones, and when you get to seabirds and hawks, it's a lot more complicated. Bigger birds have a lot more feathers to deal with, a lot longer feathers to deal with, and so they do some crazy stuff that will be a whole other lecture another time. But what's really cool is that we do know a lot about the different strategies that different species employ. And so there's this fantastic book, it's called the Pile Guide. It's known as the Bird Bander's Bible. That's because if you're a bird bander, you have to deal with a lot of feathers. And so you want to open up this book, and if you catch a bird, you want to open up the book, find that bird, and figure out what kind of molt strategy it uses. And that can help you learn a lot about the bird that you have in your hand. So we're all bird banders together, and ooh, yay, we catch a black-headed grosbeak. This is really exciting, and it's in July. So we catch this beautiful black-headed grosbeak, and we want to look at its feathers, so we're going to learn about it. Feathers, like with the saw-whet owl we saw, they had different generations of feathers. And so you can use that as a bird bander to help figure out the age of the bird you have in your hand. It's not always the case that you can do this, but you can often figure out how old the bird is, whether it's a baby, whether it's a 5th year, or whether you know it's just an adult bird. Okay, so we're going to try to do this together. We have our black-headed grosbeak, and we whip out our tile guide, and we found out that, oh, the black-headed grosbeak, Kyle says, has a complex basic strategy. So we know that. Okay, so we open up our wing, and we see this. And this is pretty remarkable, because if you look at the coverts, which are these smaller feathers above the flight feathers, you can see what's called a molt limit. Molt limit is when 2 feathers of different generations are right next to each other. So you have your greater coverts here on the inside. They're much darker, they're much nicer, they're a little bit newer. Beautiful. And then on the outside, look, yeah, you have our like old juvenile feathers. They're old and they're worn. And so, just by looking at this wing, and we know it's in July, so it's not around a time where it's actively molting, we can tell that these feathers are juvenile feathers. These were grown in the nest. These feathers are the formative feathers. They grew a couple weeks after it got out of the nest in its first few months of life. So we know that this bird has some juvenile feathers, but not adult feathers, and not all juvenile feathers. So this is a bird in its formative plumage. It's a 2nd year bird. And it's its 1st year. Ignore that. That's basically confusing. That depends on the calendar year. But so we have our black-headed grosbeak, and we know that this bird is a 2nd year bird. It's just starting its 2nd year of life. It just came back to the breeding grounds after its 1st year and round of migration. And so this is incredibly, incredibly useful to have if you're a bird bander, because you can figure out how old the bird is, and that tells you a lot about the population demographics. You can figure out how this is changing over time, how the age of birds and the survival of birds is changing with the habitat and the land around us. So being able to age birds with their feathers is really important. And then our grosbeak bites us and then it flies away. Okay, so we know that molt is highly patterned in the way that it grows, and we know that birds employ different strategies of their molt. What else do we know? How does molt start? How does the body know when it's time to molt? Again, there's not a lot of research on molt, but we do know some things. And we know that the 2 main drivers that induce the body to molt are from photoperiod and breeding. Photoperiod is the day length that indicates time of year. This is especially helpful when you get away from the equator and the day lengths are different times. I'm sure we're all experiencing that now that it's spring, thank goodness, and the day lengths are getting a little bit longer. And so photoperiod is, it tells the bird and it tells its body what time of year it is. And then breeding, of course, there could be breeding hormones that are circulating in the body that want to interact with how the body decides to start molt. So there have been some really excellent studies that have shown how breeding and photoperiod affect molt. The first one is a white-tailed ptarmigan study. If anyone's familiar with white-tailed ptarmigans, they have a molt twice a year. They'll first molt in the fall into all white plumage so that they can blend in with the snow when winter comes. And then in spring, when the snow melts, they'll molt into this like mottled plumage that matches with their rocky background. Ptarmigan, I've still never seen one. They're impossible to see because they blend in so well. But also, I'm not a very good birder, so that talks about it too. But today, these 2 big molts at 2 different times of the year. What happens in the fall, what happens in the spring. When they brought these birds into the lab, into a room that was closed off from the outside world, they could manipulate the lighting and mimic sunrise and sunset times at different times of the year. So while it was fall outside, they had the lab lights mimic the sunrise and sunset times of spring, and they found that they molted into their spring summer plumage. And then the opposite happened, that while it was spring outside, they had sunrise and sunset times that mimicked fall, and they molted into their fall winter plumage. And so we know that photoperiod, by the calendar effect, indicating which time of year it is for birds, we know that photoperiod will adjust and onset molt. We also know that breeding controls molt. So this was a study on dark-eyed juncos. And around the breeding time, just before molt occurs, they implanted a bunch of juncos with testosterone pumps. So they had artificially elevated levels of testosterone. And they found that those juncos failed to molt. They didn't molt at all. So this indicates that breeding hormones, like testosterone, inhibit molt. And it says, whoa, slow down there, bucko, I'm still breeding. Don't molt yet, even though it's the fall and photoperiod is telling you it's time to molt. Hold your horses because I have to finish breeding and I can't afford to do both those at the same time. So, and this is I had to put this photo, but it's so terrible. Okay, I'm glad I've never seen this in person, but okay, so that's basically all we know about molt. We just know a few things. We know that molt is highly patterned. We know that there are molt strategies. And we know that there are certain things like photoperiod and breeding that affect the hormones in the body. And that affects how the body responds to molt. And so of those hormones, the most relevant that have been found are testosterone, prolactin, and thyroid hormone. And that's kind of it, but there has to be other things at play. There's other things going on here. And this is hopefully where I can come in as a researcher. So these are the kinds of questions that I'm really interested in exploring during my dissertation at UNR. And so what I'm interested in is what is going on in the bird that's making it molt. And these are all my hypotheses. I just started my PhD. I haven't started this project yet. So these are all just my guesses as to what is going on. So we know that hormones are important for controlling molt. Hormones are carried in the bloodstream, and hormones in the blood are called circulating hormones. So those hormones I put up before, thyroid hormone, prolactin, testosterone, etc., those ones, when they're circulating in the bloodstream, they go into the feather follicles and they affect what's happening at the molt. But we know from the anatomy of birds that all the feathers are exposed to the same circulating hormones, right? They all are connected to the same veins, they all get the same blood flow and the same hormones. So what is making this happen? What is making primary 1 decide to molt when primary 10 is not molting? What is making this highly structured and highly patterned way molt? So those patterns, those strategies that we see, we know they exist, but we don't know how. So this is what I'm really interested in. And I'm speculating that something is happening at the level of the feather follicle. So again, this is where the feather can anchor into the skin and connect to the blood supply. This is the control center of what is going on. And so I'm speculating that there's something happening at the follicle level that is controlling how the feather responds to circulating hormones. So the way that hormones work, just a quick little lesson, we have a secreting cell. They secrete hormones into the bloodstream. Those hormones go along the bloodstream on their merry way, and then they find their target cells, and they go to their target cells through hormone receptors. And hormone receptors have to be specific to that hormone in order to get into the cell. So in our case, the secreting cell could be maybe in the gonads, and it's secreting testosterone into the bloodstream, or maybe our secreting cell is in the brain, and it's secreting photoperiodic hormones into the bloodstream. And so for birds and for molt, these could be the two suspects. And then our target cell, of course, is the feather follicle. And so there's going to be cells in the base of the feather follicle that are responding to the hormones. And they have to do that by the receptors that they produce. So the receptors they have on the outside of the cell indicates or dictates how they respond to the hormones in the blood. So if you're a cell and you have tons and tons of hormone receptors like these ones, then you're going to respond a lot better to the hormones of blood. You're going to have greater receptivity to those hormones because you have greater hormone receptors, as opposed to these cells that maybe have very few or don't have any receptors at all. So this is precisely what I'm interested in doing, and of course this is all speculation and what I think is happening and what I'm interested in exploring. But I'm speculating that feathers in time to molt express different numbers of hormone receptors when it's their time to molt. And so, as we said, these feathers molt in this patterned way. And so when it's time to start molting, primary 1 is going to express a bunch of receptors so it can pay attention to those circulating hormones. And it can let those hormones tell it it's your time to molt. But then the rest of the primaries don't produce any receptors, so they're not even going to pay attention to what's going on in the bloodstream. But then as we go down the line and as each feather starts molting, then they're going to express hormone receptors and be able to pay attention to the bloodstream. So PhDs are a long time. Maybe in 5 or 6 years, I'll have my results and I can come and share it with you guys. So I want to end on a more whimsical note about feathers and just say that feathers are one of the most spectacular things in this world. Again, I'm biased, totally. I really think that's true, and it's so spectacular. And as bird watchers, which many of us are, it's what we know and love most about birds. They're beautiful, they add color to the world, and they also make it a challenge, like shorebirds, shorebirds and gulls. The worst to try to identify, but it adds game and wonder to the world. And as birders, that's what we love. As scientists, that's what we love. And overall, as people, maybe if you don't even notice birds, you know birds exist and you can appreciate them, and any human can appreciate them largely because of this incredible diversity of feathers that they bring color to the world. And I will give it to the acoustic biologists that bird songs are a whole other poetic ballgame. But I think feathers are really what makes birds birds, and they're what we love about them. Okay. So with that, I have a lot of wonderful people to thank. All the birds I've tormented and taught over the years, like this bush pit here. And then I also want to send a huge thank you to all my co-banders. While I was banding and learning about molt, my co-banders really made me fall in love with molt and birds and kept me alive during the harvest season. I also want to thank a lot of organizations like GBO for hosting this. Point Blue is the one that taught me how to band birds, taught me about molt. And then there's a lot of resources. Bird Bander Dude on Instagram has taught me a lot. He doesn't, this is probably creepy of me, he has no idea who I am or what I'm saying. But I've used his work a lot, so anyway. And then with that, thank you all so much for listening to me go on rants about what I love about birds, and I'm happy to take any questions.
It's not a question so much as I just want to permanently thank you for expressing that a nest is just a fruitful. I'm glad you appreciated that.
I wanted to ask, is anybody studying the oil that you talked about has the UV protection and other great things?
Yeah.
Putting it into human?
Oh, that's so interesting. I had no idea. Do you guys know? Lauren and Sophia are other PhD students that study.
When you talked about it, it's like, oh, don't they want to focus?
That's so interesting. Yeah,
I know people doing something with the smell, like the pheromones.
Yeah.
Song sparrow people are working with the pheromones that are in that oil.
I also know people working on pheromones with seabirds in that oil. And
So
some
these
human
are
applications.
antibacterial, it's UV protection.
Yeah.
Sounds like maybe I want some.
Vaseline dispenser. Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. I imagine the bacteria and the parasites that it is anti are probably bird specific, like feather lice or things like that. But that's a really interesting point. I've never thought about that. I don't know pre-million biologists, but I'll look for them for you.
And how many feathers come out at once?
Okay, this is a really cool question. This totally depends. So, like I said, breeding hormones can inhibit molt and say, hold off, I'm still breeding, I'm not ready to molt yet. And so if there's a bird that molts really late in the year, then it needs to molt quicker because it has to, pretty much all birds leave to migrate around the same time. It's like when the weather is like, get out of here. And so because of that, depending on when you breed, you have a certain amount of time between you end breeding and when you start migrating. And so that time really dictates how many feathers they drop and how quickly they live. And so it also depends on the species. Some species like ducks will go everything at once and just get it over with and then hide in a tree while they're molting. That's a little dramatic, but they do kind of do that, like ducks will just like hide while they molt, and they get it all done at once, so they can be less vulnerable. And then other species like sparrows will go a little bit more slowly. And so it totally depends on how much time you have between I'm done breeding and I need to start molting. It dictates how quickly you're gonna start molting your feathers. That's a big question.
What do you think would be controlling, like, what would be the mechanism for the innermost primary expressing the most receptors in the beginning? Like, do you think that's would be genetically controlled somehow?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, this is also a good question, and something I've been thinking a lot about because I didn't have time to talk about this. I guess I can use this, but what's interesting is that, right, the onset of molt for the first feather, how does it know? But you can kind of say that about any feather, how does it know when to start expressing different receptors? And so my hypothesis for that I'd also like to test in the next few years is that I think that in addition to just expressing different receptors, they also have to know what is the feather before me doing? And am I good to start molting yet? Has it molted yet? Because if it hasn't, then I can't start. And so I think that there's also some interfollicular communication that's going on. And so primary one follicle is communicating with the adjacent follicle, which is communicating with the adjacent follicle. And so I'd like to look at some paracrine signaling to see if, for example, the follicle of primary one is releasing some hormones that go to the adjacent follicle of primary two and get it to start as well.
Then that way you would only need to know which one starts first, and then it would just trigger a cascade.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good question. Yes.
Yeah, I just had a thought going on that, like, it would make sense if, you know, one of them is like open receptive the whole time, right? And then it's like a trigger mechanism like dominoes.
Yeah, yeah, just like, the thing is that studying that is really tricky, so I'm trying to figure out how to do that right now, but this study that I'm proposing has been really hard enough, it's probably why nobody studies mold, it's been really hard to study, so, I don't know, maybe
Yeah, it must be like open all the time if, you know, like the photo period.
yeah.
So like to go through all the way and like close, and then at what point does it reopen, you know, because it doesn't like keep doing it.
Yeah, I don't know. It'll be really interesting, and the way that you can look at this is if you look at gene expression in the feather follicle nucleus, you can see which receptor hormones they're producing, what they're coding for, and so that'll tell me what they're coding for in the moment. But what would be interesting is what is existing on the cell already, and how does that change from what they're producing? Does primary one always have a lot of testosterone receptors and then just produces more when it's time to molt? Or does it produce them all at once and then it gets rid of them? I don't know, they're all interesting things. Maybe 6 or 7 years from now, all of you.
6 or 7 now.
I'm just kidding.
19 to 20 years.
Let's keep going. My children will have to take on the dissertation project. No, I am happy to answer your questions. I guess, is there any question on Zoom?
No, haven't had anything on Zoom yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming and letting me talk to you about molt.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for coming tonight, Katie. We really enjoyed that presentation, and also a big thank you to Truckee Meadows Parks Foundation for hosting us here tonight at the Rosewood Nature Study Area, because those of you that are online are not here. So that's where we are. Thank you, and we really appreciate your support. Everyone have a good night.
Thank you, Ned.